Tension rises instantly as the conversation takes a sharp turn. What starts calm quickly becomes something no one expected. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, one that neither the hosts nor the guests seem fully prepared for? Yet everyone watching can feel building in real time. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. It begins like many segments on a daytime talk show modeled after The View, with a familiar rhythm that regular viewers instantly recognize. The camera opens on the panel, seated around the table, the audience settled and attentive. There's a brief exchange of greetings, a light introduction, and then the focus shifts to the guest of the day, Bryan Cranston. He's there to promote a recent project, something the hosts briefly mention, but the tone of the conversation quickly moves beyond promotion and into broader topics, as it often does on shows like this. Joy Behar opens with a casual but pointed question, referencing Cranston's long career and the kinds of roles he's taken on over the years. Her tone is conversational, even slightly playful, but there's an underlying curiosity in how she frames it. She mentions how audiences often associate him strongly with certain characters, and wonders aloud whether that kind of typecasting ever becomes limiting. It's the kind of question that invites reflection, but can also lead into more complex territory, depending on how it's answered. Cranston responds calmly at first, leaning slightly forward, his hands loosely folded. He acknowledges that certain roles, especially iconic ones, tend to stay with audiences. He explains that while it can create expectations, it also opens doors, and that he's always tried to choose projects that challenge him in different ways. His tone is measured, thoughtful, and clearly practiced, the kind of answer that fits well within the flow of a live interview. The other co-hosts nod along, and there's a brief moment where the conversation feels entirely routine. One of them adds a light comment about how audiences still see him through the lens of past performances, and Cranston smiles, acknowledging the point without pushing back. The audience responds with a small ripple of laughter, and everything seems to be moving along as expected. But then Joy Behar follows up, and this is where the tone begins to shift, though subtly at first. She pivots from discussing his roles to discussing the themes within them, particularly the moral complexity of some of the characters he's portrayed. Her phrasing becomes a bit more direct, suggesting that certain roles might reflect or influence public attitudes in ways that go beyond entertainment. Cranston's posture changes slightly as she speaks. He leans back a bit, his expression becoming more focused. He listens without interrupting, but there's a noticeable pause before he responds. It's not uncomfortable yet, but it's enough for attentive viewers to sense that the conversation is moving into more serious territory. He begins his reply by clarifying that he sees acting as a way to explore different perspectives, not to endorse them. His tone remains calm, but there's a slight firmness now, a subtle emphasis on certain words. He explains that portraying a character doesn't mean agreeing with that character's actions or beliefs, and that storytelling often involves examining difficult or controversial ideas. Joy listens, nodding at points, but she doesn't fully step back from her line of questioning. She interjects briefly, adding that while that may be true, audiences don't always separate the actor from the role, especially when the performance is as convincing as his have been. Her tone is still controlled, but there's a hint of insistence, as if she's trying to push the discussion a little further than a standard promotional interview. At this point, another co-host steps in, attempting to lighten the moment slightly. She makes a quick comment about how that's part of what makes great acting so compelling, drawing a few laughs from the audience. For a second, it seems like the conversation might pivot back to safer ground. But Cranston chooses to respond directly to Joy's point instead. He doesn't raise his voice, and he doesn't interrupt, but when he speaks, there's a noticeable shift in his tone. It's still respectful, but more deliberate, more precise. He acknowledges that audiences can form strong associations, but he emphasizes that it's important to give viewers credit for understanding the difference between fiction and reality. As he speaks, his hands move slightly, not dramatically, but enough to underscore his points. His eye contact shifts between Joy and the rest of the panel, as if he's addressing both her and the broader discussion at the same time. The audience grows quieter, more attentive, sensing that the conversation has taken on a more serious edge. Joy responds again, this time with a slightly sharper question. She brings up the idea that media, including television and film, plays a role in shaping public discourse, and she asks whether actors have a responsibility to consider that impact when choosing roles. The The question is framed as part of a larger cultural conversation, but it carries a level of directness that changes the dynamic at the table. There's a brief pause after she finishes speaking. Cranston nods slowly, as if considering how to respond. The camera cuts briefly to another co-host, who looks between them, her expression neutral but attentive. The audience remains quiet, waiting. Cranston begins his answer carefully. He says that he does believe in being thoughtful about the work he takes on, but he also stresses that storytelling isn't meant to provide simple answers. He explains that complex characters can spark important conversations, and that avoiding difficult topics wouldn't necessarily serve audiences either. His tone remains controlled, but there's a clear sense that he's pushing back now, not aggressively but firmly. It's the kind of response that doesn't escalate the situation, but also doesn't retreat from it. Joy listens, but her expression suggests she's not entirely satisfied. She leans in slightly, preparing to respond again, and at this point, the rhythm of the conversation has noticeably changed. The easy back and forth from earlier has been replaced by a more deliberate exchange, where each response carries a bit more weight. One of the co-hosts attempts to bridge the perspectives, noting that both points can be true, that storytelling can be complex, and that media can influence audiences. Her tone is conciliatory, and for a moment, it seems like the discussion might settle into a more balanced place. But the underlying tension doesn't fully dissipate. Cranston nods at her comment, acknowledging the nuance, but he adds another point, reinforcing his earlier stance. He emphasizes the importance of creative freedom, explaining that actors and writers need the space to explore a wide range of human experiences without being constrained by the expectation of delivering a specific message. As he speaks, his delivery remains steady, but there's a subtle intensity in his voice that wasn't there at the beginning of the segment. It's not confrontational, but it's clearly more engaged. Joy responds once more, this time with a slightly different angle. She references the broader cultural climate and how audiences today are more attuned to the messages behind entertainment. Her tone is thoughtful, but there's still an element of challenge in her words. At this point, the audience begins to react more noticeably, with a few murmurs and scattered applause at different points in the exchange. It's not overwhelming, but it adds to the sense that the conversation has captured their attention in a different way than a typical interview segment. Cranston listens, nodding occasionally, but when he replies, he does so with a level of clarity that signals he's fully engaged in the discussion. He reiterates that while awareness is important, it shouldn't come at the expense of storytelling itself. He speaks about the role of art in reflecting society, not necessarily prescribing how people should think. The camera captures the panel as a whole, showing the co-hosts watching closely, some leaning slightly forward, others maintaining a more neutral posture. The usual light interruptions and quick jokes are noticeably absent now, replaced by a more focused, deliberate exchange. As the segment continues, it becomes clear that what started as a routine interview has shifted into something more layered. The disagreement isn't loud or overtly dramatic, but it's present in the way each point is made and responded to. And as the conversation moves forward, the question becomes less about the initial topic and more about how far each side is willing to take the discussion in a live setting where time, tone, and audience all play a role in shaping what happens next. As the discussion continues, the shift in tone becomes more noticeable, not because anyone has raised their voice, but because the pace of the conversation has slowed just enough for each response to carry more weight. The easy rhythm from the beginning of the segment has been replaced by something more deliberate, where each person at the table is choosing their words more carefully. Bryan Cranston remains composed, sitting upright with a focused expression, while Joy Behar leans slightly forward, her posture signaling that she's still engaged and not quite ready to move on from the topic. The rest of the panel watches closely, their body language reflecting a mix of curiosity and caution, as if they're aware that the conversation has reached a point where it could either resolve naturally or become more pointed. Joy picks up the thread again, this time framing her perspective in a broader cultural context. She references how audiences today are more vocal about what they see on screen, especially when it comes to themes that intersect with real-world issues. Her tone remains conversational, but there's a persistence in how she phrases her point, suggesting that she sees this as an important aspect of the discussion rather than just a passing observation. Cranston listens without interrupting, maintaining steady eye contact. When she finishes, there's a brief pause before he responds, and that pause feels significant. It's the kind of moment that often goes unnoticed in casual conversation, but on live television, it stands out. It gives the impression that he's considering not just what to say, but how to say it in a way that accurately reflects his perspective. He begins by acknowledging her point, agreeing that audiences are more engaged and more responsive than ever. He doesn't dismiss the idea outright, and that acknowledgement seems to momentarily ease the tension. But then he adds a distinction. He explains that while audience engagement is valuable, it doesn't necessarily mean that every piece of storytelling needs to align with a particular viewpoint or expectation. As he speaks, his tone becomes slightly firmer, though still calm. He emphasizes that part of what makes storytelling meaningful is its ability to present uncomfortable or challenging perspectives without immediately resolving them. He gestures lightly with one hand, as if illustrating the idea of balance, and his voice remains even measured. Joy responds by narrowing the focus of her question. She brings it back to the individual responsibility of actors, asking whether there's ever a moment where he has turned down a role because of the potential message it might send. It's a more personal question, and it shifts the conversation from general principles to specific choices. The audience reacts subtly, with a few quiet murmurs, as if recognizing that the conversation has moved into more direct territory. One of the co-hosts glances toward Cranston, then back to Joy, her expression attentive but neutral, allowing the exchange to unfold without interruption. Cranston takes another brief pause before answering. He nods slightly, acknowledging the validity of the question, and then explains that there have been roles he's declined over the years, but not necessarily for the reasons being suggested. He says that his decisions are usually based on the quality of the story, the depth of the character, and whether the project offers something meaningful from a creative standpoint. He adds that while he does consider the broader impact of his work, he doesn't approach it from a place of trying to control how audiences will interpret it. His tone remains steady, but there's a subtle emphasis on the idea that interpretation ultimately belongs to the viewer. Joy listens, but she doesn't fully concede the point. She leans in again, her expression thoughtful but slightly more intent, and suggests that in today's media landscape, it's difficult to separate creative intent from public impact. She references how quickly discussions around television and film can spread online, shaping public perception in real time. At this point, another co-host gently steps in, attempting to add context without disrupting the flow. She mentions that this is something many actors have spoken about in recent years, the balance between artistic freedom and social awareness. Her tone is measured, and she looks toward Cranston as if inviting him to expand further. Cranston nods, acknowledging her comment, but he returns to his original point with a bit more clarity. He explains that while he respects the idea of social awareness, he believes that placing too much emphasis on it can sometimes limit the scope of storytelling. He stresses that not every story is meant to provide guidance or serve as a moral framework, and that sometimes the value lies in simply presenting a situation and allowing audiences to draw their own conclusions. His delivery remains calm, but there's a noticeable confidence in how he articulates this perspective. It's not defensive, but it is firm, and it signals that he's not likely to shift his position easily. Joy responds by slightly adjusting her tone. She softens her approach just a bit, acknowledging that storytelling has always involved complexity. But she follows that with a question about whether the industry itself is changing, and whether actors are now expected to be more mindful of how their work is perceived. The conversation at this point feels less like a disagreement and more like a focused debate, though the underlying tension remains. The audience is quiet, listening closely, and the usual background reactions, laughter, applause, are minimal, replaced by attentive silence. Cranston considers the question, and then responds by separating expectation from obligation. He says that while there may be a growing expectation for actors to be mindful of public perception, he doesn't see it as an obligation that should dictate creative choices. He emphasizes that the responsibility of an actor is to serve the story and the character, and that external expectations, while worth considering, shouldn't override that fundamental purpose. As he speaks, his posture remains steady, but there's a slight forward lean now, mirroring Joy's earlier body language. It creates a visual sense of engagement, as though both of them are equally invested in the discussion. Joy nods, but her expression suggests she's still processing his response. She briefly glances at the audience, then back at Cranston, and adds that from her perspective, public figures, especially those with significant influence, often carry a level of responsibility, whether they choose to or not. This comment draws a small reaction from the audience, a mix of murmurs and a few scattered claps, indicating that some viewers resonate with her point. The camera briefly captures the rest of the panel, showing a range of reactions, some thoughtful, some neutral, all attentive. Cranston listens carefully, and when he responds, he does so with a slight shift in tone. It's still calm, but there's a clearer sense of pushback now. He acknowledges that influence is part of being in the public eye, but he reiterates that influence doesn't equate to control. He explains that once a story is released into the world, it takes on a life of its own, shaped by the perspectives of those who experience it. He adds that trying to anticipate every possible interpretation would be not only difficult, but potentially. His words are measured, but there's a quiet emphasis that underscores his point. At this stage, the conversation has moved well beyond its initial premise. What started as a discussion about acting and roles has evolved into a broader conversation about responsibility, influence, and the nature of storytelling itself. The tone remains respectful, but the exchange is clearly more intense than a typical daytime segment. One of the co-hosts attempts again to bring a bit of balance, noting that both perspectives highlight important aspects of the issue. She smiles slightly, her tone lightening just enough to ease the atmosphere, and adds a brief comment about how these kinds of conversations are part of what makes live television engaging. The audience responds with a small ripple of laughter, and for a moment, the tension softens. Cranston smiles briefly as well, acknowledging the comment, and Joy allows a slight smile to pass before returning her attention to the discussion. But even with that moment of levity, the underlying dynamic hasn't fully shifted. There's still a sense that both Cranston and Joy are holding on to their respective viewpoints, each willing to engage, but not necessarily to concede. As the segment continues, the pacing remains steady, but there's a heightened awareness in how each person speaks and responds. The interruptions are minimal, the pauses more pronounced, and the overall tone more reflective. And as the conversation edges forward, it becomes clear that the disagreement, while controlled and respectful, is far from resolved, leaving the panel and the audience watching closely to see how it will unfold next. As the conversation carries forward, there's a noticeable shift not just in what's being said, but in how it's being received around the table. The earlier back and forth, while still respectful, now carries a bit more weight with each exchange. The audience is quieter than before, more focused, and the panel seems increasingly aware that this moment has moved beyond a routine interview. Bryan Cranston maintains his composed demeanor, but there's a slight tightening in his expression, the kind that suggests he's fully engaged and choosing his words carefully. Joy Behar, meanwhile, appears just as focused, her posture steady, her tone measured but persistent. At this point, Joy shifts the discussion slightly, moving away from the broader question of storytelling and into a more specific example. She references how certain television characters, especially those with morally complex arcs, can sometimes be interpreted differently by different segments of the audience. Her phrasing suggests that while some viewers see those characters as cautionary, others may see them as admirable or even aspirational. As she speaks, a few audience members nod subtly, and there's a faint murmur of agreement. It's not loud, but it adds to the sense that the topic is resonating beyond the table. Cranston listens, his gaze steady, and when he responds, he begins by acknowledging that interpretation can vary widely. He agrees that different viewers can take different things away from the same story. But then he draws a clear line between depiction and endorsement. His tone becomes slightly more deliberate, his words spaced just enough to emphasize their meaning. He explains that portraying a character's journey, including their flaws, mistakes, or even harmful actions, is not the same as presenting those actions as something to be admired. He notes that storytelling often relies on that complexity to engage audiences in deeper ways, encouraging them to think critically rather than simply absorb a message. Joy listens, but she leans in again, gently pressing the point. She suggests that regardless of intent, the reality is that some viewers may not engage with that level of nuance. Her tone isn't confrontational, but there's a firmness in how she frames it, as if she's trying to ground the discussion in practical outcomes rather than theoretical intent. This prompts a brief pause from Cranston. He nods once, as if recognizing the validity of the concern, but when he speaks again, there's a subtle shift in his delivery. It's still calm, but there's a clearer sense of conviction. He responds by saying that while it's true not every viewer will interpret a story in the same way, that doesn't necessarily mean the responsibility lies solely with the creators to simplify or adjust their work. He emphasizes that audiences are diverse, and that part of engaging with art is bringing one's own perspective to it. As he speaks, one of the co-hosts glances toward Joy, then back to Cranston, her expression thoughtful. Another host nods slightly, as if seeing merit in both sides of the argument. The dynamic at the table remains balanced, but the tension is still present beneath the surface. Joy follows up by reframing her question once more. This time, she asks whether there's ever a point where the potential for misinterpretation becomes significant enough to influence creative decisions. Her tone softens slightly, but the question itself remains pointed. The audience reacts with a quiet murmur again, sensing that the discussion has reached a more focused and personal level. The camera briefly cuts to a wider shot of the table, capturing the stillness of the panel as they wait for Cranston's response. He takes a moment before answering, his hands resting lightly on the table. When he speaks, his voice carries a steady, thoughtful cadence. He explains that while he understands the concern, he believes that trying to account for every possible interpretation would ultimately limit the authenticity of the work. He stresses that storytelling often reflects the complexity of real life, and that removing that complexity in an effort to avoid misinterpretation could diminish its impact. As he continues, there's a slight shift in his tone, not louder but more defined. He adds that audiences are capable of engaging with difficult material, even if their interpretations differ. He suggests that those differences can lead to meaningful conversations, both within and beyond the context of the show. Joy listens closely, her expression attentive. When he finishes, she nods slowly, acknowledging his perspective. For a brief moment, it seems as though the conversation might settle, but she chooses to respond again, this time with a more reflective tone. She mentions that part of her concern comes from the broader media environment, where moments from shows and films are often taken out of context and shared widely. She points out that in those situations, the nuance of a character or story can be lost, leaving behind a simplified or even distorted impression. This comment resonates with some members of the audience, who respond with a few scattered nods and quiet sounds of agreement. It's a reminder that the conversation isn't happening in isolation, but within a larger media landscape that shapes how content is consumed. Cranston acknowledges this point, nodding as she speaks. When he replies, he doesn't dismiss the concern, but he approaches it from a different angle. He explains that while context can indeed be lost in those situations, the solution isn't necessarily to limit what stories are told, but rather to encourage more complete engagement with the material. His tone remains steady, but there's a subtle emphasis on the idea of trust in the audience to seek out context, and trust in the storytelling process itself. He adds that while the media environment has changed, the fundamental role of storytelling has not. At this point, one of the co-hosts steps in again, offering a perspective that attempts to bridge the gap. She notes that both of them are essentially talking about the same thing from different angles: the relationship between creators, content, and audience. Her tone is calm, and she smiles slightly as she speaks, trying to ease the intensity of the exchange. The audience responds with a light ripple of laughter, and for a moment, the atmosphere softens again. Joy smiles briefly, and Cranston does as well, acknowledging the effort to bring balance to the conversation. But even with that moment of levity, the discussion doesn't fully reset. There's still a sense that both sides are holding on to their core perspectives, even as they acknowledge each other's points. Joy then shifts slightly, asking Cranston about how he personally approaches roles that deal with sensitive or controversial themes. Her tone is more inquisitive now, less pointed, but still rooted in the broader discussion they've been having. Cranston responds by describing his process, explaining that he looks for depth, context, and a clear narrative purpose when considering such roles. He emphasizes that he's drawn to stories that explore human behavior in a nuanced way, rather than presenting simplified or one-dimensional portrayals. As he speaks, the tension in his voice has eased slightly, replaced by a more reflective tone. It's as though the conversation has moved from a point of disagreement into a space of explanation, even if the underlying differences remain. Joy listens, nodding occasionally, and when he finishes, she offers a brief acknowledgement of his perspective. There's a sense that she's willing to let the conversation move forward, even if she hasn't fully shifted her viewpoint. The audience seems to pick up on this change, responding with a small round of applause, not loud or prolonged, but enough to signal appreciation for the exchange. The panel relaxes slightly, with a few of the co-hosts leaning back in their chairs, their expressions less tense than before. Still, the energy of the segment has changed in a lasting way. What began as a straightforward interview has become a thoughtful, and at times tense, discussion about the role of storytelling and responsibility in modern media. And as the conversation continues, there's a growing sense that while the most intense part of the disagreement may have passed, its impact is still shaping how the rest of the segment will unfold. As the segment moves forward, there's a noticeable effort from the table to transition the conversation into slightly calmer territory, but the shift isn't immediate. The energy from the earlier exchange still lingers, shaping the tone in subtle ways. The panel sits a bit more upright, more attentive, as if everyone is aware that the discussion, while no longer escalating, hasn't fully settled either. Joy Behar takes a brief pause before speaking again, and when she does, her tone is more measured than before. There's still intention behind her words, but the delivery is softer, less pointed. She acknowledges that conversations like this don't always have clear answers, and that part of what makes them valuable is the ability to hear different perspectives in real time. That acknowledgement seems to create a small opening in the discussion. Bryan Cranston nods slightly as she speaks, his posture relaxing just a bit compared to earlier moments. His hands rest more loosely on the table now, and his expression shifts from focused intensity to something more reflective. One of the co-hosts takes this opportunity to gently steer the conversation toward a broader perspective. She mentions that viewers often tune in not just for light conversation, but for these kinds of thoughtful exchanges. Her tone is warm, and she briefly smiles toward the audience, which responds with a light ripple of applause. The atmosphere softens, but the substance of the conversation remains. Joy turns back to Cranston, this time asking a question that feels less like a challenge and more like an invitation. She asks how he personally navigates the balance between staying true to a character and being aware of how that character might be received by different audiences. Cranston takes a moment before answering, his gaze shifting briefly across the table before returning to Joy. When he speaks, his tone is calm and deliberate, but there's a noticeable openness now that wasn't as present earlier. He explains that for him, the starting point is always honesty, understanding the character's motivations, the context of the story, and the intention behind the narrative. He adds that awareness of audience reaction does come into play, but more as a consideration than a guiding force. He describes it as something that exists alongside the creative process rather than dictating it. His voice remains steady, and there's a sense that he's trying to articulate his perspective in a way that acknowledges the complexity of the issue without oversimplifying it. Joy listens closely, nodding as he speaks. When he finishes, she offers a brief response that reflects a partial agreement. She says that she understands the importance of creative integrity, but she also reiterates that public figures often operate in a space where their work carries broader implications, whether intended or not. This time, however, her tone doesn't carry the same level of insistence as before. Instead, it feels more like a concluding thought than a continuation of the earlier pushback. The difference is subtle, but it changes the dynamic of the exchange. The audience reacts with a few quiet murmurs, and the camera briefly captures the rest of the panel. One co-host leans slightly forward, as if preparing to add something, while another maintains a relaxed posture, observing the conversation with a neutral expression. Cranston responds with a small nod, acknowledging Joy's point without directly challenging it. He adds that he agrees public figures have influence, but he emphasizes once again that influence should not be confused with responsibility for every possible interpretation. His tone is gentle, but the underlying message remains consistent with what he's been saying throughout the segment. At this point, another co-host steps in with a comment that helps shift the focus just slightly. She brings up the idea that audiences themselves have become more active participants in media, not just consumers. Her tone is conversational, and she gestures lightly as she speaks, drawing attention to the evolving relationship between creators and viewers. This perspective seems to resonate with both Cranston and Joy. Cranston nods in agreement, adding that this increased engagement can be a positive thing, encouraging deeper conversations around storytelling. Joy also acknowledges the point, noting that audience participation has changed the way media is discussed and understood. The exchange becomes less about disagreement and more about shared observation. The tension that defined the earlier part of the segment has eased into something more balanced, though the memory of it still lingers in the pacing and tone. The audience responds with a small round of applause, and there's a noticeable shift in the energy of the room. The panelists relax slightly, some leaning back in their chairs, others exchanging brief smiles. It's the kind of transition that often happens after a more intense moment on live television, where the conversation naturally finds its way back to a steadier rhythm. Joy then takes a moment to pivot the discussion, bringing it back toward Cranston's work more directly. She references his current project again, this time framing the question in a way that connects it to the broader themes they've been discussing. Her tone is lighter now, and there's a hint of curiosity rather than challenge. Cranston responds with a brief description of the project, explaining its premise and the kind of character he portrays. His delivery is relaxed, and there's a slight smile as he speaks, signaling a return to more familiar interview territory. As he talks, the co-hosts nod along, occasionally adding small comments or reactions. The audience responds with polite applause at a few points, and the overall atmosphere feels more in line with the earlier part of the show. Still, there are moments where the earlier discussion subtly echoes through the conversation. When Cranston mentions the complexity of his character, Joy briefly references their earlier point about interpretation, though this time with a lighter tone. It draws a small laugh from the audience, and Cranston responds with a smile, acknowledging the callback without re-engaging in the debate. The camera captures these small exchanges, highlighting the shift from tension to a more relaxed, conversational dynamic. The pacing picks up slightly, with shorter responses and more frequent interjections from the panel. One of the co-hosts asks a quick follow-up about the challenges of preparing for such roles, and Cranston answers with a brief anecdote from his experience. The story is light, even a bit humorous, and it draws a more noticeable reaction from the audience, including a few laughs. This moment helps further reset the tone of the segment. The earlier intensity hasn't been forgotten, but it's no longer the defining feature of the conversation. Instead, it becomes part of a broader discussion that includes both serious reflection and lighter moments. Joy smiles during the exchange, her posture more relaxed now. She occasionally nods or adds brief comments, but she doesn't return to the earlier line of questioning. The shift is clear, not a retreat, but a conscious decision to let the conversation move forward. Cranston, for his part, appears equally at ease. His responses are more fluid, his gestures more natural, and his tone carries a sense of comfort that reflects the change in the atmosphere. As the segment approaches its final stretch, the panel settles into a rhythm that feels familiar to regular viewers. The balance between discussion and entertainment is restored, and the earlier tension becomes part of the segment's overall narrative rather than its focal point. The audience, now more relaxed, responds more openly, applauding, laughing, and engaging in the way they typically would during a live taping. The cameras capture these reactions, reinforcing the sense that the moment of disagreement has passed, leaving behind a more nuanced and layered conversation. And while the discussion has moved on, there's still an awareness, both at the table and in the audience, that what unfolded earlier added a level of depth that doesn't always surface in these kinds of interviews, setting the stage for how the segment will ultimately come to a close. As the segment begins to wind down, the overall tone in the studio has clearly settled into something more relaxed and familiar, but there's still a lingering sense that what just unfolded carried a bit more substance than a typical daytime exchange. The panel sits comfortably now, the earlier tension replaced with a quieter, more reflective energy that often follows a meaningful on-air discussion. Bryan Cranston finishes, answering a final question about his current work, offering a brief but thoughtful response that brings the focus back to his role and the themes of the project. His tone is steady, and there's a lightness in his expression that signals a return to more routine conversation. The audience responds with polite applause, the kind that acknowledges both the guest and the overall segment. Joy Behar then steps in to guide the closing moments, her voice carrying that familiar cadence viewers recognize when a segment is wrapping up. She thanks Cranston for being on the show, adding a brief comment about how much there was to talk about, which subtly references the earlier discussion without revisiting it directly. Cranston nods appreciatively, offering a quick thank you in return. There's a brief exchange of smiles around the table, and one of the co-hosts adds a light remark about how conversations like this are part of what makes live television interesting. The audience reacts with a small ripple of laughter, reinforcing the sense that the mood has fully eased. As the camera widens to include the full panel, there's a final round of applause from the studio audience. It's slightly more enthusiastic than earlier, not because of any single moment, but because of the overall experience of the segment. The combination of thoughtful discussion and lighter moments has clearly resonated with those in the room. The show transitions smoothly into its next segment, but even as it does, there's a sense that the conversation that just took place will continue beyond the studio. Moments like this tend to stay with viewers, especially when they strike a balance between differing perspectives without becoming overly confrontational. And that's exactly what begins to happen shortly after the episode airs. Clips from the exchange start circulating online, particularly the parts where Bryan Cranston calmly pushes back on the idea that storytelling should be shaped primarily by potential audience interpretation. Viewers begin sharing those moments, often highlighting the measured tone of his responses and the clarity of his points. At the same time, others focus on Joy Behar's perspective, pointing out that her questions reflected a broader concern about media influence in today's environment. Discussions begin to form around both viewpoints, with some people agreeing strongly with one side, while others appreciate the fact that both perspectives were given space on air. What stands out in many of these reactions is the tone of the conversation itself. Rather than focusing on conflict, viewers often describe the exchange as thoughtful, respectful, and reflective of real discussions happening beyond television. It becomes less about who was right or wrong, and more about the value of having that kind of dialogue in a public setting. On social media, short clips capture specific moments. The pauses, the shifts in tone, the way both Cranston and Joy maintained composure while expressing different viewpoints. Comments begin to appear noting how rare it is to see a disagreement unfold in such a controlled and respectful way on live television. Some viewers mention that Cranston's approach felt grounded and focused on creative principles, while others say Joy's questions brought up important considerations about responsibility and influence. The conversation extends beyond the show itself, with people adding their own perspectives and experiences to the discussion. In the hours following the broadcast, entertainment outlets and discussion panels begin referencing the segment as an example of a balanced on-air exchange. Rather than framing it as a conflict, many describe it as a moment where differing viewpoints were explored without escalating into something divisive. There are also follow-up comments from viewers who watched the full episode, noting that the earlier tension didn't overshadow the rest of the segment, but instead added depth to it. They point out how the conversation naturally shifted back to a more relaxed tone, demonstrating how live television can accommodate both serious discussion and entertainment. Behind the scenes, there are brief clarifications shared through interviews and social posts. Neither Cranston nor Joy frames the moment as a disagreement in the traditional sense. Instead, both acknowledge that it was simply a conversation, one that reflected their individual perspectives and the broader questions surrounding storytelling and media. That framing seems to influence how the moment is remembered. Rather than being reduced to a headline or a single quote, it's seen as part of a larger dialogue that continues beyond the show. For regular viewers of programs like The View, the segment stands out not because it broke from the format, but because it fully embraced what that format allows: open discussion, differing opinions, and the ability to navigate both in real time. As the episode settles into its place among the day's broadcasts, the lasting impression isn't one of tension, but of engagement. The conversation didn't resolve every question it raised, but it provided a space for those questions to be explored in a way that felt genuine and grounded. And for those who watched it unfold, whether in the studio or at home, it serves as a reminder that even in a setting designed for daytime viewing, there's room for discussions that go a little deeper, that challenge perspectives without overwhelming the tone of the show. Moments like these don't always stand out immediately, but they tend to linger, prompting viewers to think, reflect, and in many cases, continue the conversation in their own way. And that's where the impact of this segment ultimately lands, not in a single exchange or a single response, but in the broader dialogue it encourages. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think about this on-air exchange between Bryan Cranston and Joy Behar? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.